Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Autumn 2021 series of the Virtual Museum Lecture Series presented by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Our community is filled with diverse stories, and we recognize that our story begins with the Indigenous peoples of this land. We acknowledge that we are broadcasting this lecture on lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous people for millennia, and we would like to honor the centuries of Indigenous peoples who've walked on Turtle Island before us. My name is Sarah Nixon, and I am the public programmer here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Welcome back to the lecture series. We hope that these lectures provide a bit of historical joy and spark imagination and exploration of our city's rich history. If you're joining us for the first time, why not go back and watch some of the other lectures that we presented over this past year. There are now 30 lectures for you to enjoy. Just look for the playlist Virtual Museum Lecture Series on our YouTube channel. And we are also happy to announce that the lecture audio is being added to our podcast. VMLS via podcast will help to share the lecture with an even wider audience. So if you're new, you can certainly catch up on podcast, or if you want to go back and listen to your favorite lectures again. We have uploaded the first 7 lectures of the Spring 2020 series onto the podcast, and we will continue with more episodes in the new year. So something to look forward to in the cold winter months. But very exciting news. Speaking of the new year, we are thrilled to announce the winter 2022 lineup of virtual museum lectures. And we are very excited about these lectures. And to help me announce the lineup, we have some familiar faces with us today. We have fellow lecturers, Adrian Petrie, Visitor Services Coordinator, and Kathleen Powell, Curator, Supervisor of Historical Services, and our lecturer tonight. So everyone, mark your calendars for winter 2022 with these exciting lectures.
On February 1st, 2022, we'll welcome our new public programmer, Abby Stansfield, as she kicks off the series with a lecture about early Black history in our community titled The Daily Grind, Records of Freedom Seekers in St. Catharines. On December 26, 1858, Jacob Blockson wrote a short message from his new home in St. Catharines to his wife still living in the United States. With 5 lines, he describes the important parts of his new life in Canada. The importance of the daily experience that he was free to build was not lost on Jacob or his fellow freedom seekers. This lecture will examine the daily life of freedom seekers as they settled into their new home in St. Catharines.
Sometimes known as the Black Defenders of Upper Canada, the Colored Corps Militia Unit famously served in the War of 1812 and was called out to the Rebellion of 1837. Less remembered, however, is how the Corps took on many tense, violent, and deadly altercations and riots with particular skill in what can only be described as Niagara's Wild West between the 1830s and 1851. Join us for this lecture titled Upper Canada's Black Defenders Take on Niagara's Wild West, for some remarkable stories presented by Visitor Services Coordinator Adrian Petrie on February 15th, 2022.
And we are pleased to welcome special guest Dr. Howard Slepkov to speak about the history of the local Jewish community on March 1st, 2022, with his lecture titled From Anatevka to St. Catharines, The Early Years of Congregational B'nai Israel, the Spiritual Home of the Jewish Community. Topics will include why the Jews left Europe, spread throughout the world, and what attracted some to St. Catharines. Howard will also speak about the building of synagogues in small towns and why synagogues were vital to building community and connecting its members.
At the end of the Second World War, close to 1 million Canadian veterans re-entered civilian life, and a new era of optimism and prosperity began. Public programmer Sarah Nixon takes a close look at how veteran readjustment and other social trends impacted life in St. Catharines in the post-war years, with her lecture, Return to Civvy Street, Post-War St. Catharines, presented on March 29th.
Friendship centers are the heart of the local Indigenous community and provide a touchstone of support. Learn about the story of friendship centers and about walking the path towards truth and reconciliation. Carl Dockstader shares this fascinating story with his lecture, In Friendship, The History of Friendship Centers and Truth and Reconciliation, presented on April 12th.
We are delighted to welcome special guest Dr. Roy Finkenbrine, a professor of history and director of the Black Abolitionist Archive at the University of Detroit Mercy, to present a lecture on the important role Indigenous peoples played in facilitating the movement of freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. Dr. Finkenbrine will present his talk titled The Indigenous Underground Railroad on April 26th.
Kathleen will explore Canada's khaki election, one of the most contentious elections in the country's history, and will look at the lasting impacts of the decisions made up to Election Day, Monday, December 17th, 1917, with a lecture titled Election 1917, Wartime Canada Goes to the Polls.
And finally, we are very excited to welcome back Natasha Henry, historian and president of the Ontario Black History Society, who returns to the lecture series with a talk about Emancipation Day on May 24th.
Of course, as lecture participants, you are all already registered, and we will continue to send out the links to our lectures on the day. But please do share registration information with your friends and family so that we can continue to grow the audience for this wonderful local history lecture series. Thank you all, and we'll see you in February 2022.
Awesome. Thank you so much for helping out with this exciting announcement, Kathy and Adrian. I know I'm very much looking forward to the winter, and I hope you are too. Okay, let's continue on as we dive into some exciting history tonight. Please feel free to make use of the chat box to ask questions or send comments. We will moderate these during and at the end of the presentation. I should note that there is a slight delay in the broadcast, so if we miss your question, we will get to it at the end of the presentation. I'd also like to take a moment to encourage you to make a donation to the museum in support of our programming. Your donations help us to continue to provide the high quality and enjoyable programming that you have come to expect from us. We really appreciate any donation you are able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880 or visit us at stcatharinesmuseum.ca. We did get a new website this week. It's very exciting, so just check that out anyways. But also, if you visit our website, you will find a link to provide a donation online as well. The link to the online portal was included in your email reminder for this evening. Your donations do make a difference. Thank you. Okay, and with that, I am so happy to hand this over to our curator and supervisor of historical services, Kathleen Powell, to deliver the final lecture of 2021, entitled When the World Changed, St. Catharines and the First World War. Give it
Okay.
away, Kathy. Here, I'll stop sharing my screen and you should be able to have all the controls now.
Okay. Let me put myself up here. All righty. Slideshow. Can you see my slideshow?
I
There we
can't see. Oh, yeah. There it is. Okay.
Yay.
All right. I'll give it the full to you, Kathy.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining me tonight for my lecture called When the World Changed, St. Catharines and the First World War. I'm going to talk tonight about how the First World War changed the world. This isn't going to be a military history for the most part. It's more of a social history, but I hope you enjoy it. And let's get right to it. On June 28th, 1914, Olive Weller, Jessie Dennison, and Catherine Welland Merritt had just arrived in Budapest, Hungary, as part of a grand European adventure. Here they are coming off the train. They were staying at the Grand Hotel Hungaria. In her diary for that day, Olive Weller describes their afternoon, and I quote, "After making ourselves clean and respectable looking again, putting on cool dresses as it had turned very warm, we joined the two friends and all had lunch together, a perfectly good one too, of no less than 6 courses, cooked Hungarian style." And that's the end of that quote. But I'll get back to Olive Weller in a moment. They spent the day motoring around the city, and when they returned to the hotel, and I'm quoting from Olive's diary again, the English-speaking man in the office told us in a very excited tone that they had just received a telegram saying that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife had been assassinated in Bosnia, end quote. She goes on to note in parentheses that this was a great shock to the people, we have since learned, although they seem to think in the end it will be better for the country. Oblivious to the eventual import of this event, the women continued with their sightseeing and shopping in the city, with Weller noting that while we were walking there, we noticed several black flags were already up, and before long, almost every building had from 1 to 3 of these solemn looking flags. By June 30th, they had traveled to Vienna, Austria, and on July 2nd, they were able to be firsthand witnesses to the events that would change the face of Europe. On that day, a part of their sightseeing would include seeing the funeral cortege of the Archduke and his wife. And here's what Olive Weller wrote about in her diary. "After supper, we hurried over to the corner, just 2 blocks away. There we found a good spot to see the funeral of the Archduke and his wife. We stood from 9 till 10:30 and had hard work to keep our places there was such a crowd. However, when it was over, we felt well repaid for our patience, as we had seen one of the historical events of Austrian history. All along the streets, there were crowds and crowds of people, and all were very quiet. A funeral at night to us seems very mysterious, but it seems that it is the custom for royalty there, and that only the servants and attendants go to the evening funeral, while the relatives remain at home. There was no music, there were no flowers, just the soldiers mounted and on foot. A few carriages and hearses, each driven by 6 coal-black horses with 2 outriders for each hearse. All the bright-colored uniforms, the handsome, well-kept horses, the spotless carriages, and the riders with their lanterns instead of torches, as they used in olden times, made a solemn and wonderful sight. Just as we were getting into bed, we heard a great noise outside, and we hurried to the windows and saw a regular mob of men coming up our street. And we hurried to the windows and coming up our street, shouting and singing their national anthem, which is the same tunes as one of our hymns, while they waved flags made out of kerchiefs. Soldiers seemed to be on guard everywhere, and we afterwards learned that these men were giving a demonstration against Servia because it is said the plot to assassinate the Archduke originated there for political reasons. All night it was very noisy, and it was ages before we could get to sleep. The next day, Friday, July 3rd, 1914, Olive, Jesse, and Catherine, dressed in a hurry, and rushed to the imperial residence, or Hofburg, to get in line to see the bodies of the Archduke and his wife lying in state. The doors opened at 8 a.m., and by 8:30, the three women were in the chapel. And here's how Olive describes it, and I quote, "Saw the two caskets of wrought gold, supposed to be very handsome, but very flashy, I thought. These caskets were up quite high and side by side with tall lighted candles surrounding them, and two very picturesque and motionless guards with leopard skins over their shoulders stood at each side at the foot of the caskets. At the rear end of the chapel were two more guards in handsome uniforms. The chapel was all decorated in black, and the only flowers seen were two crosses of white blossoms lying on the floor at the head of each casket. These were from the Archduke's children. We just walked in single file to the chapel, around the biers, and out the door." What I really love about this description is that it's so very accurate. This photo is a photo that was taken from a newspaper in Europe at the time, that was published at that time. And she describes the scene almost exactly as we see it in the photo. So, you know, having this kind of oral history is such an important part of telling our story overall. And so I was really struck by that. Later in the day, they took a break in a cafe as they waited for the Emperor Franz Joseph to come from the Hofburg. Olive describes the scene thus: "When we thought it was time for him to come along, we stood on the sidewalk, and in a very few minutes, he drove slowly by in an open carriage, so we had a splendid view of him. He looked very old, bent, and sad, and exactly like the pictures we see of him everywhere, as well as on the postage stamps. At 10 p.m., we saw the funeral for the second time, leaving the Berg for another station. The streets were packed with people again, and we were very glad we did not have to stand. This time, the funeral passed just at the end of our street, so we had a splendid bird's eye view than the first night. The colors in the uniforms showed up so well, there seemed to be more there, and it did not present quite so solemn an appearance. When Miss M returned from town this morning, she brought with her some postcards of the funeral, so we have come to the conclusion that the Austrians are not slow." It wasn't until July 25th, with the party of ladies now in Munich, Germany, that Olive writes, "Rumors of war today." And then the next day she notes, "Great excitement here on account of the war." On July 28th, news of impending war once again intrudes on the holiday party, and I quote, "The news today is that Austria-Hungary declared war on the Servians exactly a month to the day after the assassination." Still oblivious to the storm on the horizon, on August 1st, Olive writes in her diary, "We learned today that Germany had mobilized her troops Thursday last, and we discovered we had been under martial law for 2 days. That accounted for no mail and money being tight." And later she says, "Professor Robinson and family left in a great hurry for Italy as they got a war scare." By August 3rd, the ladies were visiting the British consul to see what they should do. They were told to get passports, and their efforts to get money at the bank were in vain as there was no money to be had. On August 6th, she notes, "The first news we heard this AM when we entered the dining room was that England had declared war. This immediately made things look more serious." It's a bit of a an understatement, I guess. These three women from St. Catharines were right in the midst of experiencing world-changing happenings firsthand. It's much easier for us as modern day viewers of these events to see them in the light of the 100 years plus that have come after, and how the shots that killed Franz Ferdinand would set off a reaction that would change the world. Even for three ladies from the other side of the world, they would see that change in their lives going forward. As I mentioned, this lecture is going to explore some of the life-changing impacts that came about as a result of the Great War. The world and Canada would never be the same. But let's get back to the events of September 1914. So back to St. Catharines now. In the meantime, when the news of war reached St. Catharines, the news was greeted with enthusiasm. According to the Standard at the time, a crowd numbering thousands assembled before the Standard office on Queen Street, reading the bulletins. And when the flash came that Germany had declared war on England, the people cheered and cheered and then cheered again. Hats were thrown in the air and solid citizens slapped each other on the back and yelled themselves hoarse. The crowd sang, "God Save the King," then followed "Rule Britannia" and "The Maple Leaf Forever." About 10:15, the Salvation Army arrived and the enthusiasm grew greater. A big Union Jack was flung to the breeze from Standard Hall, and as it waved, the crowd cheered again and again. Flags were handed around, and these were enthusiastically waved. The band played "God Save the King," the Marseillaise, the Boys of the Old Brigade, and Old Lang Syne. With these celebrations, the news spread across the city that the country was at war. According to the John Jackson and Sheila Wilson History of St. Catharines, war fever and the fervor for Britain and empire continued throughout the opening weeks of the war and throughout the next 4 years for that matter. And the Union Jack flag was flown across the city. From the start, the war was already impacting life in the city. Many local men who had previous military service in England and overseas returned overseas to enlist. Additionally, the community had a large Italian community living here, and many who had been working on large construction projects, such as the building of the Welland Ship Canal, which had just started. And many of those Italian immigrants also returned to Italy to enlist. Locally, the non-permanent militia was mobilized and brought up to full strength, and all military units were actively recruiting in the city, looking for skilled men to join the fight. This is just a couple examples of the call to fight, essentially the call to enlist into different units across the city. But let's hear from one of our local boys about his early experience enlisting and beginning his preparation for war. This is Jack Hardy, and he enlisted in St. Catharines in August 1915 at the age of 17 years old, after lying about his age to get in. And Jack Hardy wrote a diary about his time as a soldier. Here is the first entry related to his enlistment in his own words. Enlisted at the age of 17 with the 7th Depot Field Battery on August 17th, 1915. Commanding officer, Lieutenant Lawrence. A battery consists of 250 officers and men. Prior to enlisting, I was employed at the Lincoln Paper Mill as apprentice to the printer. A number of Meryton men enlisted in the new battery, such as L.V. Suckling, John and Hames Reed, Alex McLeod, Fred Cocky Sutton, and Jimmy Wilson. Our pay was $1.10 a day, plus 85 cents for living at home. $10 was kept out of our first pay towards our uniforms, which we never received until we were in Toronto in November. Our hours of training were 8:30 till noon and 1:30 to 4 p.m. Our training consisted of artillery foot drill, section gun drill, rifle drill, PT, lectures, and route marches. We often marched to Port Dalhousie and back. We enjoyed this part of the training as the weather was mostly fine. In September, we erected quite a number of tents on the armory grounds and also in the park at Grimsby for the troops who were marching from Niagara-on-the-Lake to Toronto Exhibition Camp. Jack went overseas on the SS Cameronia and arrived in England on September 24th, 1916. After being transferred to the Signal Corps, he was transferred to France and disembarked at Havre on August 22nd, 1917. The perceived threat of war, while not as immediate as in Europe, continued to be a presence in Niagara. In addition to the recruitment and shipping off to overseas service, and in response to the perceived threat of terrorist attack from enemy aliens living in Canada, the Welland Canal Force was established to protect the important national infrastructure along the Welland Canal, at the border crossings with the United States in Niagara Falls and all along the Niagara River, as well as at the electrical power stations. According to William Smyth in his book about the Welland Canal Force, and I quote, "In Niagara, the 19th Lincoln Regiment and the 44th Lincoln and Welland Regiment were placed on active duty and detailed to provide the core of the Welland Canal Force, the mission of which was to guard the locks and shipping facilities along the Welland Canal." Bert Hill of St. Catharines, who in this photo is on the far left-hand side of the photo, enlisted with the Welland Canal Force in 1914 and was sent to train at Camp Niagara in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and later sent to guard the border in Niagara Falls, which is what this picture is here. He's sitting on the bottom of one of the bridges. Bert and his girlfriend, Mary, who was soon to be his wife, were avid postcard writers, and they kept in touch by postcard, even with Bert still located in the Niagara region. So he was in Niagara-on-the-Lake, she was in St. Catharines. Bert's experience illustrates the extent that the military had begun to permeate the daily life of the local people who lived in St. Catharines and Niagara. It became obvious almost immediately that this war would be one like no other, and that total mobilization, both military and civilian, would be required to be a success. This postcard from Bert to his girlfriend, Mary, which essentially he's kind of courting at this point in time, seems so out of place in wartime, but brought the immediacy of the war close quickly. Here, he's making a date to meet up with Mary and taking some time away from camp. And he says, "I arrived okay and everything in good order. Got my boots up good and brass also. I'm making arrangements with one of the boys for Friday night. I will leave on the 6 car." Soon after, Bert and Mary would be married, and he would be shipped off to France. We will hear a bit more about Bert later in the presentation, but for now, let's stick with the home front. There's no question at all about how the First World War impacted the countries and people of Europe who were right in the center of the action, right in the center of the action, so to speak. The visuals we've all seen of the trenches on the Western Front and destroyed towns in France and Belgium are iconic. But what of how the war changed society as a whole? In the experience of history, war subjects nations and their people to immense strains, and the dangers faced can sometimes tear societies completely apart, or at a minimum, transform attitudes at a much greater pace than in peacetime. The Great War was no different in this case. This war strained Canadian society and transformed it. This war forced the Canadian government into decisions that would have seemed inconceivable in previous times. This war changed the world and Canada as a nation. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how the war changed Canada and, by default, changed St. Catharines as well. The Canadian government under Prime Minister Robert Borden throughout the war was forced to make tough decisions in order to get Canada's soldiers successfully through to the end. The First World War was the first time that Canada had to fully mobilize both the civilian and military establishment in order to fight the war. All the resources of the country needed to be pulled together in support of this war for civilization, as it's been called. This war, for the first time in Canadian history, would put sweeping and unprecedented powers into the hands of the Canadian government, and more specifically, the cabinet of the government, to decide on the best course of action to take to fight the war. And to that end, there were 5 pieces of legislation that came into effect during the war that would change the face of Canadian politics forever. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these this evening. Firstly, and most importantly, was the War Measures Act, which you can see here is this is actually the very first page of the War Measures Act. The Canadian War Measures Act was brought into force for the first time during the First World War, and it stayed in effect until 1920. The War Measures Act was a federal law that gave the federal government extra powers during times of war, or insurrection, invasion, or real or apprehended fear. This bill was passed into law on August 22nd, 1914, although it was actually backdated to the start of the month, shortly after Canada joined the war. And it gave cabinet the power to pass laws, regulations, without having to take them to Parliament for full debate, to get things done quicker, essentially. And the government felt that they needed to do this right at the very start of the war in order to be able to mobilize the Canadian forces as quickly as possible. These extraordinary powers given to cabinet were in order to pass laws which might be necessary for security, defense, peace, and the welfare of the country. But this piece of legislation gave the government huge sweeping powers, and it gave them the power to enforce things like censorship, control, forced prevention of publications, forced prevention of publishing maps, plans, photographs. It also censored communications and means of communications. It gave the government the power to enforce arrests, detentions, exclusions, and deportations, controlled the harbors, ports, and territorial waters of Canada and the movements of vessels. The act gave the government the power to enforce transportation by land, air, or water, and the control of the transport of persons and things. The government could control trading, exportation, importation, production, and manufactures, taking over without permission, and disposing of property was also something the government was given control of through this act. The War Measures Act was passed unopposed in 1914. The threat of war to Canada at the time was so great that there was no question that in order to fully mobilize the entire country, an act such as this would be required immediately. The War Measures Act, as I said, gave the government sweeping powers. This allowed the federal government to suspend civil liberties and to bypass Parliament to do things through orders in council that it felt were necessary for war. For instance, factories could be told to stop producing farm implements and start manufacturing arms and ammunition instead. Immigrants who had come from what were now enemy countries like Germany had their movements controlled, and anyone thought to be an enemy sympathizer could be arrested and kept in internment camps without trial. The most notorious and far-reaching actions brought into effect as a result of the War Measures Act was the internment of enemy aliens to camps. And this also included dispossessing them of their property and, as we'll hear later, disenfranchising them. Thousands of civilians were interned under the authority of the War Measures Act when the government labeled them enemy aliens. Most internees were recent immigrants from Austria, Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman empires. Some were Canadian-born or naturalized British subjects. Another 80,000 people, mostly Ukrainian Canadians, were forced to register as enemy aliens, to carry identity papers, and to report regularly to the police. This doesn't really sound like the Canada we're used to hearing about, does it? Over the course of the war, the federal government interned 8,579 enemy aliens in 24 receiving stations and internment camps across the country. Of the total number interned, 5,954 were Austro-Hungarian origin, including Croats, Ruthenians, Slovaks, Czechs, and Ukrainians. 2,009 were German, 205 were Turks, and 99 were Bulgarians. According to Sir William Dillon Otter, who was in charge of the internment operations, 3,138 detainees were actual prisoners of war, meaning they had been captured or were enemy reservists. The rest were civilians. Internees also had their property confiscated, much of which was not returned after the war. During their internment, they were often required to work on large labor projects, such as building, this is just an example, building a portion of the golf course at Banff National Park. They were also they were also pulled into building roads, clearing the bush, cutting trails. They did work logging and mining, just things that nobody wanted to do. It was just basically hard labor throughout. And they were paid less than half of the daily wage offered to other laborers. On the local front, Niagara that is, there was an internment camp actually located in the Niagara Falls Armory between December 1914 and August 1918. 24 prisoners were held at the armory, possibly in the indoor rifle range in the basement. There is not a lot of information about this internment location, sadly. There are some court-martial records from the Welland Canal Force, which provides just a tiny glimpse into what might have been happening to these internees at this camp. And this is related to the escape of an Austrian prisoner whose name was George Heinovich, whose number was prisoner of war number 345, and he escaped from the armory in March 1917. Allegedly, he escaped out an unlocked door. And the record in the court-martial record says the following. The court find the escape of the Austrian George Heinovich was made possible through the door of the room in which he was confined being unbolted. This being due to an oversight of Corporal J.A. Martin, commander of the guard, and to the fact that Lieutenant Chambers, the officer in charge, did not visit the prisoners that night, which according to his orders, he is required to do every night at certain times stated. The court recommends that a more suitable method of securing the back door of the armories be employed. The court also recommends that alterations be made in the fan lights of the prisoners' rooms, as on examination, it was found possible for a person to get out of a room through the fan light opening. I think that gives you a pretty good handle on how this George Heinovich escaped through the light at the top of the door and out the back door, which wasn't locked. Additionally, the War Measures Act was used to ban 253 publications in Canada, including 222 American publications, 164 foreign language, and 89 leftist publications. Following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, socialist reading material in particular was targeted for censure through the War Measures Act. And membership in left-leaning organizations or organizations that were really peace organizations whose mission was to really push peace were forbidden. People were also arrested and interned for their political beliefs. The War Measures Act has only been enacted 3 times in the 20th century. As you know, we've heard about the First World War now. It was also enacted during the Second World War, and then it was enacted, which probably is when most people recognize the War Measures Act, in 1970 during the FLQ crisis in Quebec. The War Measures Act was actually replaced in 1988 by the Emergencies Act, which was passed by Parliament at the time. And that made the War Measures Act was repealed when that was passed. And the new act would actually change the way the War Measures Act worked, in that it forced Cabinet to seek Parliament's approval for its actions, and for any laws passed to be subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which clearly a lot of the actions as a result of the War Measures Act would not have met the bar set by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Again, all across Niagara, and these are just small examples, evidence of a country at war could be seen. By New Year's 1916, it was clear that this war was not going well for the Allies, and they would require more men in order to support those at the front and to continue to provide reinforcements to the front lines. At the rate the war was going, there would soon not be enough men to fight. Prime Minister Borden made a bold promise to Canadians in his 1916 New Year's message. He said that he had authorized a force of 500,000 men in order to keep up the war effort. You can imagine what kind of commitment that would look like when you think about the fact that Canada had only 8 million population at the time. So basically 1/16 of the population is being committed to go and fight overseas. One of the challenges was that Canada had been committed to a volunteer system of enlistment. Sadly, while there was initial enthusiasm for military service, that initial enthusiasm did not continue its gangbusters pace. And unsurprisingly, those still at home were not really feeling very encouraged by the lists of casualties that were printed in the newspaper every day. It was clear that the voluntary system was failing to keep up with the needs of the war. Sir Robert Borden had traveled to France in April 1917, and he visited the front lines after the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And he was visibly moved by what he saw, and even more convinced that conscription was necessary. Conscription was Canada's most divisive issue during the Great War. Recruitment of volunteers went well into 1916, but there were some disturbing patterns. British-born Canadians enlisted in huge numbers, but English-speaking Canadian-born enlistment was relatively low. French-Canadian enlistment was lower still, and immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe had little incentive to enlist. With the Canadian Corps' 4 divisions fighting in France and Flanders by the fall of 1916, and with casualties outpacing the flow of volunteers, the politicians and military planners in Ottawa had reason for concern. Borden said the following on May 18th, 1917, when he presented his intentions to introduce conscription. And I quote, "The Canadian Corps cannot be maintained without thorough provisions for future requirements. Hitherto, we have depended on voluntary enlistment, but it is apparent to me that the voluntary system will not yield further substantial results. All citizens are liable to military service for defense of their country. Therefore, it's my duty to announce to the House that early proposals will be made to provide by compulsory military enlistment on a selective basis such reinforcements as may be necessary to maintain the Canadian Army in the fields." He went on to say that the number of men that may be needed will not be less than 50,000 and will probably be 100,000. Because the issue was so contentious, Borden felt that it was necessary to get Wilfrid Laurier's liberal government on his side and proposed forming a coalition government that would be made up of members of both parties and would remain in power for the remainder of the war. Borden understood that conscription would need full support across the country, including in Quebec, to keep the country from fracturing. The French and English divide in Canada was at the core of the issue. A British Army Council study that was prepared in late 1916 and was prepared for the War Cabinet in London noted that Canada had enlisted 9.6% of its male population, while 37.5% of British-born Canadians had joined. Only 6.1% of Canadian men of British origin had done so. It's quite a stark difference in percentage, just in the English population. The enlistment of foreign-born Canadians was 6.5%, and French Canadians was 1.4%. The French Canadian enlistment rate, the Army Council study declared, was the lowest, and I'm going to quote here because it's just an odd sentence. The Army Council study declared that it was the lowest in the White Empire. A sessional paper that was laid before Parliament on the 14th of June, 1917, stated that as of April 1917, there were 125,245 Canadian-born English-speaking men overseas in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. 14,100 French-speaking men born in all parts of Canada, but only 6,779 serving in units organized in Quebec and presumably resident there. The histories and the information of the period is very starkly English versus French. So it's really difficult to make sure that that we have as historians, that we try to make sure that we pull that apart and look at the sources from a very kind of non-judgmental lens. However, it's kind of difficult based on the way they've written them. So they go on to say that there are 155,095 British subjects born outside of Canada, but Canadian-born and especially French-speaking had not come forward in sufficient numbers. The issue of conscription polarized the country. Ernest Lapointe, a Liberal member of Parliament for Kamouraska, called the conscription legislation brought forward by the Borden government, and this is a quote, the most important legislation since Confederation. And he noted that it would be unacceptable to Quebec since it was a direct violation of all the pledges given by this government, this Parliament, and all the public men of this country to the Canadian people. During the summer months of 1917, the St. Catharines Standard ran numerous stories related to conscription. This is from the Globe, obviously, but the Standard also ran some, I'll show you in a moment, related to conscription and leading up to the federal election of 1917. The conscription bill, officially known as the Military Service Act. Oh, let me go back here. Actually, I want to make notes. So this is from the Globe, and it talks about conscription. The Standard didn't ever run a page like this that said conscription for Canada in huge letters, but it certainly would have been available in St. Catharines for local residents to read. This I'm going to leave on for just a moment, just because it's a really interesting article that was written kind of like an editorial, that was kind of like a memorial for voluntary enlistment, and it's kind of a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, but in loving memory of that noble fellow voluntary enlistment who departed this life many months ago. But his place will be filled by another known as conscription. He did not live in vain. Young man, your time is drawing nigh. Anyway, I found this quite amusing. This actually ran in the Standard on August 22nd, 1917, during the debate about the Military Service Act. So the conscription bill was officially known as the Military Service Act, and it was drafted by the Minister of Justice at the time, who was Arthur Meehan, and it passed second reading with a vote of 119 to 55, and 26 of Wilfrid Laurier's Liberals voted for the legislation. So they crossed the floor basically and voted for that. Laurier's support in English Canada was severely impacted as a result of the Liberals' stance against this bill. And the Military Service Act was signed into law in August 1917. The Military Service Act was actually part of a suite of legislation that also included the Income War Tax Act, the Military Voters Act, and the Wartime Elections Act. Not only was it important to find a way to bring conscription into being, but Borden recognized that he needed the support of the electorate in order to get tacit support for his wartime agenda. We're going to come back to the Income War Tax Act. I know that sounds super exciting and you're really looking forward to it. We'll come back to it in a few minutes. But first, we're going to talk about the other two pieces of legislation related to voting and the election. Borden believed that the country needed to get to the business of winning the war at all costs. And he also felt that the best way to do this would be with a coalition government. Even before legislation was passed for the Military Service Act, Borden had, like as I mentioned, had approached Sir Wilfrid Laurier about forming the coalition government. Laurier, who knew he would lose his base of support in Quebec as a result of conscription, was also not in favor of coalition, and he rejected the idea. Partly because a coalition government was an important part of Borden's plan to win the war, two other pieces of legislation were introduced: the Military Voters Act and the Wartime Elections Act. To illustrate Borden's way of thinking at the time, he wrote in his diary on September 25th, 1917, "Our first duty is to win at any cost the coming elections in order that we may continue to do our part in winning this war and that Canada not be disgraced." With this legislation in mind, Borden and his government would engineer the most gerrymandered election in Canadian history. This would be the election to decide on the continuation of conscription and the move forward with a coalition government. This election, often referred to as our khaki election, would take place on December 17th, 1917. I'm going to talk a little bit about it today, but not too much, but come back in the spring and you can hear my whole lecture on the khaki election. But here's how the election was rigged in favor of the pro-conscription, pro-union party. The first thing was the Military Voters Bill. This bill allowed all men in uniform and those who had finished their service honorably to vote. Men under 21, and this is a quote from the legislation, men under 21 and Indians serving in the Canadian Expeditionary Force were also eligible to vote, both for the first time. Women in uniform and nursing sisters would also be given the vote, a first for Canadian women in a federal election. The legislation also allowed soldiers to vote simply for either the government party, the Unionists, or the opposition Liberals. They didn't have to pick a guy who was running, they could pick just the party. Additionally, soldiers would be allowed to cast their vote in their last constituency of residence if they knew it. If they didn't know what that was, their vote would be assigned by the government-appointed electoral officer. The electoral officer position was a political appointment at this time. So this was actually very thinly, almost not even veiled voter manipulation. The bill contained a clause directing that the overseas votes from the soldiers and the women who were overseas would not be counted for 31 days after the election. This actually allowed the votes to be applied where they could determine the outcome in close contests. Borden's conservative government used closure in the parliamentary debate for the conservative majority to pass the bill on the 29th of August, 1917. The second piece of legislation that impacted the 1917 election was the Wartime Elections Bill. This legislation was also introduced by Arthur Meehan on September 6, 1917, and allowed for widows, mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters of soldiers to vote. At the same time, some normalized immigrants from enemy countries who had come to Canada after 1902 lost their right to vote. And conscientious objectors also lost their right to vote. This legislation also directed the federal government to appoint enumerators to compile the elector rolls. Previously, this had been a provincial responsibility, and the federal government took it over so that they could have more control over the process. Again, Borden's conservative government also used closure on this bill to force it through the House of Commons on September 14th, 1917. It's estimated that this gerrymandering of the vote gave the vote to about 450,000 women, while removing the vote from 50 to 70,000 foreign-born Canadians. In the end, unsurprisingly, soldiers voted massively for the Union government, 215,849 to 18,522. This shouldn't come as a huge shock. Private Victor Wheeler summed up the thoughts of many soldiers on the front lines when he said, "Politics to us frontline soldiers was rather academic. However, if a national election was unavoidable in wartime, we men wanted to see sent to Ottawa the party we believed would be most likely to prosecute Canada's part in the war with maximum vigor and effectiveness." Did this increase in the franchise make a difference? Yes, it did. Just to give you the heads up, the civilian population vote results were 841,944 to 744,849. Soldiers added more than 200,000 votes. So the gerrymandering actually did make a difference in the end, because the election was essentially won by roughly 100,000 votes. Before we move on from here, what of conscription and its lasting impacts? Did it make any difference to the war effort in contrast to the lasting impacts it created for Canada? This is a big debate in Canadian history, and people fall on both sides of the debate. Of the 401,000 men who were called up for service through conscription, just under 100,000 were on strength with the Canadian Expeditionary Force by November 11th, 1918. Of those, about half, 47,500, had proceeded overseas, and about half of those had been taken on strength in units in France and were instrumental in shoring up the ragged Canadian infantry battalions during the last months of the war. The effectiveness of the conscripted soldiers in the final push to win the war is really another example of how things might look different in hindsight, and the fact that we have, have had 100 years or more than 100 years to study this history. But at the time, what did they think? At the time of conscription, almost all the generals and politicians expected the war to continue into 1919, and that the need for conscripts would have been much greater had the war gone on longer. To modern historians, it might look like a little too late, a little too little, like too little too late in the war, and that it would have huge repercussions for the country's future. The repercussions from conscription continue into the modern day Canada, and we most generally can see it in the French-English divide in our country, which I think is really interesting to see in this map. You can see the blue are really the majority conscription union government versus the red, which was the non-conscription liberal government. So the final piece of legislation I want to talk a little bit is one that most people love to hate, which is income tax. This legislation would change the political landscape forever. And it was the War Income Tax Act of 1917. This piece of legislation was introduced just shortly after conscription, and it was a part of that whole group of legislation that I've been talking about all along, that was brought forward by Borden's government in direct response to his pledge to do everything in his power to support the war effort from the home front. Prior to the war, many might not know this, I didn't really know too much about this prior to this, researching this talk. Prior to the war, 2/3 of federal revenues came from customs tariffs, which were general taxes on imported goods that were levied at the border. A quarter of federal revenues came from what was termed other revenues, which included income from things like the post office and railways and departments that were, they weren't really crown corporations, but they weren't really like line departments of the government yet. And so revenues that came from that. After the outbreak of war, the only federal tax that had been levied as a result of the war was a tax called the Business Profits Tax, which was introduced in 1916, and it was fully designed to tax profiteering that was happening as a result of the war. They recognized it almost right away that profiteering was happening. People were making tons of money off of the war, and they should be paying for that. Profiteering was universally condemned. And a tax on corporations taking advantage of wartime business was considered, everyone thought it was a good idea, and businesses taking advantage were considered contemptible. At the time that this tax was imposed, and it was actually retroactive to the start of the war, it was imposed at a steeply rising rate on any profits over 7%. The Borden government saw this as the best way to seize incomes that were being inflated as a direct result of wartime profits. In its first year, the wartime profits tax still actually only accounted for 5% of federal revenues. And as you can imagine, war is expensive. And it was really putting a massive burden on the country and on the finances of the country, how to continue to pay for this war. The First World War placed an unprecedented drain upon the financial resources of the country, the Dominion of Canada. And to better utilize Canada's finite resources, every aspect of supply was regulated by the Dominion government. Rationing was introduced for everyday items, from building materials to gasoline to food. As you can see here, this article from the Standard that talks about meatless days. The government, limited in the ways that new revenue could be gained, also issued wartime savings bonds, which we've heard about numerous times, and I don't really talk about in this lecture, and raised import tariffs and levied new wartime taxes, such as a luxury tax on tobacco and alcohol. It was one of the first of many taxes introduced during the war, which we continue to have today. By 1915, a Dominion tax had also been imposed on transport tickets, telegrams, money orders, checks, patent medicines. Staple items were taxed, such as tea and coffee were being taxed by the end of the war. And after initial goods and services tax were introduced, the Dominion government moved to tax the incomes of businesses. As I mentioned, they started with the Business Profits War Tax Act. And businesses were required, if your corporation had 50,000 or more, you had to file a yearly tax return. Personal income tax was introduced under the Income War Tax Act of 1917. This act both expanded the scope of the business profits war tax and introduced a tax based on the yearly income of most Canadians. Those individuals who were exempt from the tax included the Governor General, foreign consuls, and those who were on active service overseas. While it's hard to believe today, because nobody likes a tax, the general opinion of the income tax in 1917 was incredibly positive. With most Canadians heading to war, most people in Canada felt that richer Canadians should be forced to contribute more to the war effort. Contrary to popular mythology, the tax was actually not explicitly temporary. Finance Minister Thomas White, who brought the bill forward related to this tax, recommended only that the tax be reconsidered at the end of the war. And, since we still have income tax today, clearly we know what happened with that. How did the tax work? Married Canadians with an income below $2,000 or unmarried Canadians with an income below $1,000 were also exempt from filing a tax return. Under the Income War Tax Act, eligible taxpayers that did not submit a tax return, this is crazy, were fined $100 per day with a maximum penalty of $10,000. This is a huge fine, especially considered that a married person's income might be $3,000 for a year. And they were probably only expected to pay $20 in income tax on that. But the fine was massive. So there was really incentive to file your income tax return. So I'm not going to go too much more into history of taxes. I'm sure that that's probably not what most people were expecting this evening. So I've talked a lot about legislation, and legislation was incredibly important to how Canada changed after the war. But let's return. We talked about the home front and we talked about legislation, but let's return to the war front for a few moments to wrap up. And as we mark the end of the war on November 11th, 1918. On that day, local soldier Roy Maynard, who is here in this photo, this is actually a photo of him before he went overseas, who also wrote a memoir of his wartime experiences. On November 11th, 1918, here's what he said in his memoir, and I quote, "We got word that the armistice has been signed on the 11th of November, 1918, and pondered what the next move would be. I believe it was a case of everything coming to a standstill and making certain there were no more outbursts or retaliations." It's hard for those of us living in a post-World War I world to imagine wartime remembrance without the poppy, John McCrae's poem in Flanders Fields, war memorials in every community, and thousands of war graves of identical stones across the landscape. These icons of remembrance are all products of the Great War and the establishment during the war of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. All war memorials and war remembrance today, most of the iconography is memorialized from things that happened in the First World War. With the reality of the 50,000 plus Canadian men who did not return from the war, including the 340 plus men from St. Catharines, it began to sink in for those at home. There was also the reality of how to deal with those who were now demobilized and who would return home to a changed community, but also as changed men. Let's go back and talk about Burt Hill. So these included men like Burt Hill, who we met earlier, and who went overseas to fight, and who was wounded during the war and lost the lower half of his left arm, as you can see in the picture on the right-hand side of this photo. And Bert's actually standing in the back row of the other photo. He's in the very back row, fifth from the left. But the change he's kind of an example in my presentation about the changed man who came back after having lost his arm in the war and who would struggle to find work as a result of his disability. But he would maintain a sense of humor throughout the rest of his life. This also included men whose wartime experience left internal scars. Veterans associations, including the Great War Veterans Association, the precursor to today's Royal Canadian Legion, grew out of this need for returned men to find camaraderie in the society of their fellow veterans. I think it'd be odd to even consider what the world would be like without the Legion. It's such an important icon of in Canada today. The war was over, but the world, Canada, and St. Catharines included, were forever changed. And we'll, as a final note, go back to the words of Roy Maynard, who said, "One thing is certain, we were better equipped for what we had to do in France than we were for what we had to do at home." And thank you so much for joining me this evening for my presentation. I think Sarah's going to come back and join us.
Kathleen, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I'm just going to
unshare us here.
Yeah, let's
There we
get the
Okay.
techie stuff out of the way. I will share my screen again. Yes.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, okay, Kathy, thank you so much for that. I really appreciated your close scrutiny of the primary sources in your lecture tonight. It really offered a human perspective of the impact of the First World War. So I really appreciate that. And I look forward to see if we get any comments or questions. But okay, just like that, we are now wrapped up the autumn 2021 series of the virtual lectures. Holy moly. To the folks at home, if you do have any questions or comments for Kathleen, please do post them in right here in the chat here. And we will get to those after we wrap this up. Like I said at the beginning, there's a little bit of a lag, so I'll give you my ending spiel, and then we'll see if there are any questions or comments. So we again want to really thank our viewers for attending tonight's lecture. And especially for all of your support this season. This is our third season of virtual museum lectures, third or fourth. Oh my goodness. We've been doing it since April 2020. So we really appreciate all of you for going on this journey with us. We know many of our listeners and viewers tonight have been with us from the very beginning. So thank you. And if you have enjoyed tonight's presentation, please do consider making a donation to the museum so that we can continue to deliver the high quality programming you expect from us. And to make a donation, again, you can call the museum during our operating hours at 905-984-8880. And new this fall, as we mentioned at the beginning, you can make a donation online via our ActiveNet portal, which you can find on our website. The link was also included in our email reminder this evening. Your donations do make a difference. And with our wonderful guests, we've now delivered over 30 lectures. So please do check out the playlist of previous lectures on our YouTube channel and catch the audio on our special podcast, VMLS via podcast. Here's a little screenshot of the podcast in action here. We would also like to remind everyone to please like, follow, and subscribe to all of our social media channels, including right here on YouTube, as well as WordPress, our podcast, wherever you get podcasts. We are all over the interwebs. And if you enjoy our content, please do share it in your networks to help more of our community join in all of our historical adventures that we get up to here at the St. Catharines Museum. And then next, On our next on the virtual museum lecture series, we have the Daily Grind Record of Freedom Seekers in St. Catharines, presented by Abby Stansfield on February 1st, 2022. Oh my goodness. And the virtual museum lecture series is produced by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center and the city of St. Catharines. Whew. My goodness, we've wrapped it up. Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if we have any comments or questions in the live chat here. Going on. Okay, we have Jerry said very thorough, Kathy. Great job. So we have that.
Hey, Jerry, we love you.
Again, it's so great to have these consistent folks joining us for all of our lectures. I know that I had a question, Kathy. Again, I was really struck by the sources you used Olive Weller's diary, for example, letters from Burt Hill, but also newspaper articles, actual like the wording in the acts that really shaped Canada at this time. I was really interested in what struck you most, like what sources were the most striking for you. I know that you've studied the First World War for a while now. What really struck you this time around in the way you've researched it this time?
I didn't know that much about legislation. I guess I just assume, like, I don't know. Most people don't think this is the most exciting thing. So I'm sorry to all who didn't find that exciting. But I was really interested in how the legislation kind of all pulled together. I think we all know about conscription and how that was so contentious. And then some people may or may not have had some awareness of this gerrymandered election that happened in 1917, which I really have to thank so much. There's a great book that was written about it by Maurice Dutiel, and which is great, very helpful resource. So those things I found, and reading the legislation somewhat was very interesting. So to me, that was really interesting. And to hear, like, to read the legislation at the same time as reading the diary of the guy who was bringing in the legislation, right? Like, to me, that was really interesting to try to get in his headspace a little bit. And that's always what I'm trying to do as a historian. But I have to say that the source that I found the most compelling and that really struck me the most was that diary entry from Olive Weller about the funeral when she went to the viewing of the caskets, because I read the diary entry first, and I had before I did the PowerPoint presentation, and thought it was super interesting that these three women, two from Niagara and one from Toronto, were there, like right in the middle of this, don't even realize what's happening. And she's writing about it in her diary, so detailed. And then I came across the photo. And to me, that's like, this is why like material that's in people's own words and artifacts go together so well. So we had her description, but to actually have a photo of what she's describing was just amazing. I was excited when I saw the two together. I know I'm a bit of a nerd that way, but it was very exciting.
I think that's all anyone interested in history, though. When you read about something like in the meta, or you read it in a history book, and then you see the source that puts you right in that moment in time, there's something so like transcending about that, where you feel like you've uncovered, I don't know, something greater than yourself. I totally agree with you. And I don't know, I found your discussion of legislation really interesting. I've also never really put much thought towards it, but the way you presented it really shows, again, like you have these primary sources, people's lived experiences, and then the laws that shaped their lives. And like the idea of the income taxes and how someone who didn't pay their income taxes would be fined $10,000 would be terrifying. So I really appreciated what you did today. Thank you, Kathy. It looks like we don't have any questions. We're just lots of great lectures and great positive comments for you. So that's always Always a great thing as well. Yeah, is there any other final words or anything that you thought afterwards that you wanted to, I don't know, add or share before we wrap this up?
Just to give a shout out to my lecture next in the spring about the khaki election. Honestly, the khaki election was so interesting. And, I think it's so, it's almost like it's modern at the same time. Like we hear about gerrymandered elections all over the place in the world. And even today we hear about elections that are developed based on, the electoral district is developed so that the right party wins it. And I think to hear about this election in 1917, I'm hoping we're going to have some great sources from the newspaper and some great sources from the period. And so shout out to that. Hopefully join me if you found this interesting. Join me then.
I love that. I love the shout out for the next season. I think that's a great way to wrap up tonight's talk too. Kathy, thank you so much again for your really fascinating lecture on the First World War and its impact to St. Catharines. And to everyone at home, please tune in, not just for Kathy's khaki election of 1917, but for all of the great content that we have to offer you in winter 2022. I hope you all have a great evening, and we will see you on our socials soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.